All right, thank you for joining me. This is our interim coverage between chapters 4 and 5. I like to insert a short unit on classroom management. This is because as we get ready to address all 13 of the federally recognized categories of disability, how you manage students with those disabilities and combinations of those disabilities as you are also managing students without documented disabilities. That's classroom management. And this is consistently the thing that Truman MAE grads cite as what they think they're least prepared for in that first year of teaching. It's not just Truman MAE grads who feel underprepared for the classroom management challenges of teaching. This is actually national data. Every teacher preparation program that collects this data shows the same result. So I know it's challenging, and I know a lot of our classroom management skills accrue naturally over time, but we also started this course with the startling figures of the attrition rate for teachers in Missouri, and classroom management challenges factor into that high attrition rate. So we're going to try to tackle these problems and keep our disability lens throughout the rest of the course. And so that means we're going to focus on classroom management itself right here in this interim lesson. In the state of Missouri, we do officially subscribe to the positive behavior support system of classroom management. Missouri is not alone in this. The majority of states do have some sort of state guidelines, if not policy or regulation or even law, requiring that schools at least introduce positive behavior supports. And another confusing thing is that not all states use the same name. Positive behavior supports is what Missouri calls it. It has been positive behavior intervention and supports at the national level, although I think I'm understanding from our trainers that that may be changing. Missouri wanted to drop the intervention, the I part, because Missouri did not want schools to think that positive behavior intervention and support was only for special education or only for problem behavior students. Referring back to our RTI, response to intervention framework, Missouri wanted positive behavior supports to be what we offer everybody, that it's universal, it's everyone. So Missouri dropped the I. You'll have to just kind of be on alert for classroom management systems that are actually following positive behavior supports, but may have a different label. Even some of your school districts in Missouri may put a different label on it. I've had a student tell me that Jefferson City public schools use what's basically positive behavior supports, but they call it something else. I think it was something related to the high school mascots or something. But anyway, the framework is going to be quite common, even if the particular label of the name is different. In your team activity, in your team exercise for later on today, you'll see a prompt that's going to ask half of your team to examine the National Center website and half to examine the Missouri website. I've also reproduced the links for you in that exercise. Then I'm wanting you to discuss what of value you find on each website and to identify if there's a strategy that you have encountered on one of these websites that you will include in your teaching strategies repertoire assignment. The foundational principle of positive behavior supports is that we don't want to react to classroom misbehavior. Rather, we want to forestall it. We want to prevent as much misbehavior as we can. And research has really helped us here. There are a lot of things we can do that will prevent management problems with behavior from ever percolating to our attention. Thank goodness, right? We're not stuck with just reacting. We can actually do some things to prevent. Here are two of the major prevention techniques that positive behavior supports helps teachers learn how to implement. The first is to establish classroom expectations, and we do that in PBS by setting up a matrix. You'll see some examples of those, and I'm also going to ask you and your teams to create a matrix. For PBS, it's stronger if an entire school, building, or even better, district establishes aligned, similar expectations for behavior. But this can be successful even all the way down to the level of just your own individual classroom. So if you are in a school that has not adopted PBS, you can still use this principle of establishing classroom expectations through a matrix for just your own self-contained one classroom. The second thing that research informs us is very effective at preventing misbehavior is to clearly, firmly establish classroom procedures and routines. You know, idle hands are a problem, not just in classrooms, but in workspaces, at home. How many of you already have children? You know, when your kids are idle, that's when stuff happens that you don't want to have happen, right? Same thing in your classroom. Establish, clearly, firmly establish classroom procedures and routines. Cut out the chances that a child, a student, will have idle hands. Especially dangerous times are those transitions, when we're going from one subject to another, or when we're going from independent seat work to whole class work, or when we are entering the classroom for fifth period, or exiting the classroom on the way to sixth period, or turning in late work, or turning in seat work, or, you know, all those transitions. And in a school day, there are hundreds of them. This means that there are hundreds of opportunities for student behavior to go astray. Our best preventive act is to firmly and clearly establish classroom procedures and routines so we have formal behavior expectations for those danger points. The beauty of just these two techniques is that we can define and encourage expected behavior, and don't tell anybody, don't tell your students, we can define and discourage the unwanted behavior. The less public we are about what we don't want students to do, the better off we are. Because when somebody tells you not to do something, don't you just want to do it? Human nature isn't really that different from generation to generation. Positive behavior supports draws on behavior and motivation research to understand one major thing. Behavior has function. It gets the student something they want, or it helps the student avoid something they want to escape. All right? So it's important for us to read the meaning of the challenging behavior we're confronted with in a classroom. That behavior is not about, I'm going to get Dr. Lockbaum's attention. The behavior is never, I hate Dr. Lockbaum, I'm going to just see what I can do to rile her up. That's not usually the function. In fact, I've never had that as the function of misbehavior in my classes. Every time I've had challenging behavior that I really needed to address in a classroom, it has been traceable back to the student wants to get something that's desirable to them, or they want to avoid something that's undesirable to them. And here's the key, and some of your cultural lens needs to be brought forward again into this unit. Sometimes the thing that the student thinks is valuable to them, I would never have guessed was valuable. It boggles my mind that that's something that student wants. Or sometimes what the student has tried to avoid that they find undesirable, I thought would have been desirable. So this is where our cultural lens can really help us read and understand that student behavior that we're trying to work with. Sometimes what the student wants, what they're hoping to obtain, is they simply just need more stimulation. We have students who have grown up with very high levels of stimulation from chaotic home backgrounds, or some of our video television addiction means that there just has to be constant stimulation, constant frame shifting. They're just by the time we get them to school, they're just kind of wired that way. And sometimes the classroom, where we have deliberately tried to minimize distractions and keep focused attention, sometimes that simply doesn't offer the stimulation level that students are accustomed to, maybe perhaps even addicted to. And so the misbehavior gets some attention, it gets a distraction going, it gets a little more stimulation into the system. Sometimes the misbehavior is to get social approval. All right, so we find this happens a lot in cultural and ethnic groups as well. Here in Northeast Missouri, the cultural or ethnic group may be rural redneck. And so a student who is very gifted in, say we have a young male high school student who's very, very gifted in a discipline that he and his network consider to be feminine, that student is probably going to showcase misbehavior as a way of gaining social acceptance with his peer group that's important to him, while still getting himself the exposure to that discipline that he knows he's good at. So that's something that requires us to really know our students, really know our location, our area, and the cultural environs of our school. Sometimes the behavior is an attempt to avoid or escape something. And generally, it's an attempt to avoid or escape a learning task we've laid out that the student thinks is just too hard or too boring, or maybe sometimes by the time we are dealing with high schoolers, maybe it's just the habit. It almost becomes a game sometime for students to see how much of the schoolwork they can get by with avoiding. Of course, one of the things we need to do is make sure our assignments are authentic so that they have at least some measure of intrinsic value as perceived by our students. But not all of life is fabulously interesting. And one of the things we are charged to teach students is how to buckle down to the grind and get something essential done. As adults, there are all kinds of things we have to do every day that we don't especially find intrinsically gratifying. But the longer you put them off, the worse they get, and they don't really disappear, do they? The dishes don't get done just because you put it off a day or a week. They're still waiting there, or at least at my house, they're still waiting there. I do not yet have a magic fairy who comes in and takes all these undesirable tasks off of my list. And I doubt very much that our students do either. So if we are correctly reading the meaning of some of these challenging behaviors, we can understand that the student is exhibiting them to try to get out of something, or the student is exhibiting them to try to gain some kind of social recognition, or the student is exhibiting them because they need more stimulation, or there's some kind of sensory payoff. Now, for the need for the social recognition, that can be a desire for social recognition by adults or by peers. And this is where my experience in misreading what was valuable or desirable to the student really plays out. My perception of what is desirable is clearly not the same thing as a 14-year-old boy. It just isn't. And I when my children were young, I felt like I was a little bit in touch with the reality of what was important to students who were the age and had the interest involvements of my own children. But my children are grown and gone, and clearly my inside track has disappeared with it. So never underestimate how different your value system might be from that of your students. Even if the behavior your student is exhibiting is designed in their mind to get the attention of adults, you may be on two different planets about what social recognition attention might really be. Now with the peers, that's also sometimes a mystery. The closer you are to your students, not just in age, but in cultural background, or at least cultural understanding, the more likely you are to be able to accurately read why that behavior will achieve that social recognition among their peers that the student strives for. So your culture unit never disappears. Please bring the lens of intercultural competence to every chapter in this, and to every chapter and every lesson in this course. So given what we know about the function of behavior, and particularly the function of misbehavior, we want to set up a system where students don't get what they want when they behave in ways we don't want. And more importantly, we want students to get what they seek when they behave in ways we do want them to behave. We're going to speak that language of the misbehavior. This is where the positive behavior supports behavior matrices come in. They establish the expectations. And one of the important things for us to remember is never skip the step of establishing expectations. You cannot assume that one classroom full of students share the same expectations for behavior in your classroom. You cannot expect that. Well, you could, but you would be wrong. So let's not set up false expectations, all right? Many of our students simply have had such lackadaisical raising that the idea that there are behavior expectations anywhere is kind of novel to them. But the other thing that is true is that students may have established expectations through video, social media, through dysfunctional households or neighborhoods. And so they've got very strong expectations, but those expectations don't function well in school. So there's a situational awareness kind of gap that sometimes happens, even with our students who come to us with already existing sets of expectations. The existing sets they have may not be appropriate for school because they may not be appropriate for supporting learning. So never skip the step of establishing expectations. It can be an eye-opener to probably half of your students. In the PBS behavior matrices, we always state behaviors positively. Instead of saying, don't run around the pool, say, always walk around the pool, right? Positively stated, much less confusing, much more direct for understanding, but also we want to avoid planting the notion of what we wouldn't want students to do, because then we're going to find students understanding they will get attention if they break the expectation. All right, so positive behavior supports behavior matrices are positively stated. Another thing is they are consistent across as wide a slice of the school life as you can make it. It's great if it's a whole school building or a district. And in Missouri, that's frequently possible because we have so many school districts who have signed on to PBS. But even if it's not possible at a district, school, or building level, it can be done in your own classroom. The third bullet point is something that's fairly important to think about. Establishing expectations is great, but we also run the risk of falling victim to cultural myopia or cultural short-sightedness if we establish these expectations all in our own little professional educator bubble. It's very strong if behavior matrices are developed at least in part, and I would stress probably they should be only in part, with student and stakeholder input. So it's a good thing to do to bring these forward for discussion with your students when before you're formally teaching the expectations. You may or may not wish to actually modify them, but the mere act of bringing them forward for discussion and brainstorming often will establish some buy-in on the part of your students, even very young students. Don't discount, don't think, oh, I'm going to be a first grade teacher, so I would never bring these things forward to 6-year-olds. No, actually, I think you might have as good a luck, if not better luck, seeking stakeholder input from 6-year-olds than you might from 16-year-olds. So develop the behavior matrices expectations somewhat with student and stakeholder input. This is why when whole districts adopt behavior matrices, these are read and brainstormed and augmented, refined at the school board level in public citizen meetings. Stakeholder input can be that important to the ultimate success of your expectations. Also, even when matrices are established or are adopted across an entire district, the matrices themselves may need to be tweaked and refined a little bit to be developmentally appropriate. A district may adopt be respectful as an overall behavior expectation, no matter the age, no matter the location, whether it is in an extracurricular or curricular activity. Be respectful may unify all the behavior matrices expectations across every instance in the district. But clearly, the specific definition of how to be respectful may vary from the high school to the child care center to the football field. So some flexibility and some specificity are appropriate within specific matrices, individual matrices, even when an entire district has adopted PBS. Here's a matrix that was adopted by a district near us here in Northeast Missouri. And you can see down the left-hand column, the expectations are all stated positively. You can see across the top row that the expectation is consistent across many locations. Would you assume this behavior matrix was for secondary or for elementary? This is also available as an attachment on Blackboard if you would like to examine it more closely. Here's another matrix from a school district near us here in Northeast Missouri, also available at that same link on Blackboard. Would you surmise that this matrix is for elementary or for secondary? All right, now we have a behavior matrix that's the overall shape, arc, if you will, of the behavior we wish to see in our school environment. The second strategy that research informs us can be very effective at preventing the outbreak of misbehavior in the first place is establishing procedures and routines. And I've bullet listed here just some of the usual suspects, the times when behavior is likely to spiral out of control unless we have firmly established and taught procedures and routines. Arrival routines, whether this is for the whole day in an elementary classroom or coming back from lunch or gym, or whether this is arrival at individual periods in the secondary setting. Arrival routines are hugely important. This is why so many teachers use bell work. Some of your schools where you might work, understand the importance of arrival routines to the point that they have prescribed them. They have prescribed which arrival routine will be used in every classroom in their setting. So pay attention, arrival routines are that important. Homework submission routines. This is something that I always used to just groan about when I was assisting Truman faculty with their teaching. I hardly ever witnessed a Truman faculty member who had a homework submission routine, and 10, 12 minutes of instructional time could easily evaporate by the instructor standing at the end of a row, or worse, walking up to each individual student desk to retrieve that homework submission. Homework submission routines have to be efficient, and you must establish one. Group formation routines. How much time, instructional time, have you seen wasted as people try to number off or try to pass out color codes, or all kinds of group formation routines? It's important to have groups throughout your instruction, but it's also important not to lose that instructional time to form the groups. So figure out what your instructional aims are for the groups that you plan to use, and explicitly teach how to get into those groups upon an abbreviated signal of some sort. Test protocol routines. These are things that you do not want to have to instruct every single time you have a test or exam. You don't want to lose that kind of instructional time or test taking time. Here's something that often disrupts secondary routines: game day or assembly routines, all those days when you're going to have shortened, you're going to have some kind of upheaval in the usual schedule. Go ahead and pre-plan and pre-teach procedures and routines for those off kind of days, those different kind of days. Dismissal routines. Oh boy, this is second in importance only to arrival routines. How many of us have seen 10 minutes of instructional time wasted because students had their eye on the clock, and at 10 minutes before the time they were to leave, they start closing books, banging chairs? Dismissal routines are important, and if we don't establish the kind of dismissal routine we want, we will get a dismissal routine, but it might be generated with those dysfunctional behavior payoffs in mind. So you'll get an arrival routine, you'll get a dismissal routine. You don't want to leave a vacuum there. You want to guide the establishing of those routines, and then you want to explicitly teach them. Role play, move your feet through the routine, explicitly teach the routine. Do not assume that your students will understand what you mean in the directions to these routines the first time. Do not assume that your students will understand that there needs to be a routine. Teach it just like you would teach the content of your courses. So in your teams, you're going to want to discuss how many other procedures and routines can you identify thinking back over your own experiences. And then to get more ideas of the trouble spots where you might want to introduce a procedure and routine, you can see the attachment on Blackboard, Catalog of Routines and Procedures Examples. Getting specific instructions for a particular routine or procedure is a good use of an entry in your teaching strategies repertoire. These are the things that if you have a good assortment of these procedures and routines and you have taught them the first 2-3 days of the school year, these will make your life as a first-year teacher infinitely better. The whole approach of positive behavior supports is that we are not waiting for misbehavior to percolate up to our attention. We are preventing it. And we are preventing it by offering what research has shown us is so effective for behavior management to everybody. The whole school gets it. We don't wait until we have a student misbehaving to decide we need a behavior matrix and then only share it with that misbehaving student. No. Everyone gets it. We do it first. And in the same way that RTI works for content acquisition, RTI, if you will, positive behavior supports should be successful with about 80% of our population. And so 80% we should be able to prevent misbehavior outbreaks from about 80% of our student population. I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty good ratio. Now, all of that work is preemptive, preloaded, and it doesn't always work. There's that 20%, okay? 20% of the population, or if you want to think of it another way, about 20% of the time, you're still going to have dysfunctional and misbehavior percolate upward to the level that it needs to have your attention. Here's the essential step, but the one that I always found the most exhausting, and that is giving effective praise when you catch the students doing what they're supposed to do. So one, you have to be attentive enough to catch them doing what you want them to do. And then you need a ready-made, pre-made script of positive feedback, okay? A lot of the literature talks about effective praise. I find it easier for me to conceptualize as positive feedback, all right? And you want to go ahead and create your script of positive feedback you'll be ready to give, because when you are on the spot in the moment and you're actually giving a lecture on causes of the Civil War, it's too difficult to think of the positive feedback right then. The other problem is, and the reason this is so exhausting, is because research tells us that there need to be at least 4 instances of positive feedback for every single instance of shaping or criticism that we give. 4 to 1. And to be honest with you, more and more of the research is saying it's got to be 7 to 1. I don't know about you. I don't think I'm physically capable of doing the 7 to 1, so I'm holding on to the 4 to 1 from the older generation of research and just hoping for the best. This is why you've got to have a pre-made script. You can't possibly think of 4 instances of positive feedback to give while you're doing the lecture on the causes of the Civil War. All right? You've got to pre-make this repertoire, this script. Here's a couple of other tips for effective praise or effective positive feedback. Remember, we don't want to just be saying nice things, although, you know, the world could use a little bit of that. Our goal here is to say the nice things that ensure that the student gets back on track with the behavior expectations we want, okay? So to do that, we complement the action, not the person. We're trying to help the student understand that they are powerful in their own behavior decisions. It's not that they're just a bad person. How many of us have encountered a student who's given up, who's failing, who's misbehaving, because they've become convinced they're just bad. There's no hope for them. They're just bad. This actually happened to me at the concluding week of this past semester. I had a student that was emailing with me in communication and refused to take my offer of an incomplete because he wrote back that something was just wrong with him. He was bad and he couldn't do college work. Okay, that breaks your heart. It breaks your heart. How much more when it's a 7-year-old? So complement the action, not the person. We're trying to help our students understand that they have some mastery over their behavior decisions and they can do it. And it isn't just because they're nice. It isn't because there's some characteristic intrinsic to them. It's because they make good decisions. You followed all the steps of peer tutoring, or maybe that's too much when we're trying to bring a student back to our behaviors. Maybe we say, you followed that first step of peer tutoring. Keep going. Rather than, that was so nice of you to help your partner. You see, we try to complement the action, not the character of the person. And then there's some research that's telling us that we probably should limit the use of the pleasing the teacher stems, like, I appreciate this, or I noticed that. I'm still waiting for this research to really be conclusive, but I bring it here because they are using this principle in the PBS trainings that you might receive as a new teacher in new teacher orientation. Limit, you don't have to eliminate, but limit the use of pleasing the teacher type of stems. The reason that we want to be careful, wary of this, is that we are trying not to teach our students to be people pleasers. Again, we want them to have control, mastery over their own decisions. And inculcating a desire to just please the adult in charge, that may become problematic later in life if we have helped develop someone who is overly concerned with pleasing others and not so directed on controlling and mastering their own decisions. So I think every now and then it's okay to say things like, I appreciate how this team has everything ready to go, or I'm noticing that Carrie has lined up beautifully for going to the gym, or, you know, these things are fine once in a while, but let's try to govern our own feedback to encourage the mastery and control of our students over their own behavior choices. Well, everything's failed and we still are having this disruptive behavior. Probably it was a full moon and the weather's bad and it's the day before Christmas break and it's just falling apart. How do we get students back on track? Well, there are some proven useful, fairly simple techniques. First one is proximity is your friend. You know, as you see a little bit of misbehavior beginning to occur, you know, and the student in your 5th hour government class starts to rummage in her purse to bring out her nail polish, that's probably a time to go walk right up next to that student. Just to let them know you see what they're getting ready to do, all right? Proximity is your friend. So you can use it in this sort of preemptive way, but also proximity throughout the lesson. As you are moving around, for one thing, you need to be moving around, doing quick formative assessment on how your students are doing, but also just establishing the firm knowledge in your student's mind that you're gonna be over by them several times during the lesson. That's a good preventative. But definitely when your systems have failed and you've got misbehavior percolating, proximity is your first line of defense. We also sometimes have students who are trying very hard to meet the behavior expectations, but they've just got a nervous tick, or they've just got something that means they fall off of the system fairly regularly. It can be very helpful with these students to establish a signal or a nonverbal cue just between the two of you. It's a private deal. You're kind of helping them gain that social attention of you. If you are a respected adult for that student, this can be effective. We have the story of a teacher who worked out a signal with one of her students who had some manifestations of ADHD, and the signal was that she would tug on her ear, kind of like Carol Burnett used to do. You're probably all too young to remember Carol Burnett. Anyway, she would tug on her ear as a signal to that student, I see you, and I see you're kind of starting to spin, and can we rein it in? And just that extra little external signal kind of would catch that student's attention and help them begin to do their self-monitoring steps. This particular teacher recounts how there was a day when she was tugging her ear quite a lot, and one of her other students came up to her after school and said, "Mrs. So-and-so, are you okay?" And she said, "Well, yeah, why do you ask?" And the student said, "Well, you've been tugging on your ear all day, and my baby brother, when he does that, he has an earache." So that will help you remember how much your students are paying attention to you. And this is one reason why little signals or nonverbal cues that you've arranged in private beforehand with a particular student can be very successful, getting them back on track. Ignore, attend, and praise. We talked in the previous slide about how to give effective, positive feedback, and giving it and withholding it are both ways of trying to get students back on track. You've got a student who's spinning out of control in the back row. Maybe there's a student in the seat directly in front of them who is getting all the materials ready for the project. This is a very good time to walk closer to that student who's having the behavior challenge and say, "Oh, I just love the way Jacques is getting all his things out." Now, I know I've just used the pleasing the teacher stem, but you know, we do what we can, right? "I just love the way Jacques is preparing for what we're about to do next." Ignore the misbehavior, but attend to it, and then offer the praise, the effective, positive feedback to the student within the sphere of that student that's experiencing the challenge. Offer that effective, positive feedback for the behavior you're wanting to elicit. We can also do what's called redirect, and that is if the student's challenging behavior is designed to garner the attention of their peers, that means we need to step in and redirect so that the peers' attention is redirected to us or to whatever it is we want to have them being paying attention to. So an immediate, firm, clear redirect is called for. It can also be that we need to reteach the behavior expectation. You know, we've got to teach our expectations, our procedures and routines before we can expect them to be implemented. But just like the content, the cognitive content we're teaching, sometimes students don't get it one pass, right? In fact, most of the time, students don't get it in the first pass. So it does not hurt to go ahead and plan into your schedule a few intervals when you will reteach some aspect of your behavior matrix or some one of your procedures or routines. When you have a whole school building or district that has adopted the behavior matrix, this often is taken care of you by the larger infrastructure of the school. So you may have been in a school that had adopted behavior expectations, and periodically the counselors offer classroom or school-wide instruction, sort of refresher courses or elaboration courses, if you will, on each one of the behaviors. You may have to do a little mini version of this in your own classroom when you're having several outbreaks, if you will, of challenging behavior. And finally, you'll see this is a theme through a lot of techniques working with students with disabilities, but it's also effective working with students who have no diagnosed disabilities. Provide choice. Even in the midst of a meltdown, even in the midst of a behavior meltdown, sometimes providing choice cuts through that lizard brain, that emotional brain, and helps us reactivate the logic brain in our students. So sometimes the choice can be as simple as, do you want to stay at your desk, or do you want to go over to the quiet corner? Do you want to stay at your desk, or do you want to go over to the quiet corner? Okay. I've had teachers recount to me students having emotional meltdowns, flinging themselves on the floor in front of the doorway to the class, writhing, banging their legs on the floor in total screaming meltdown fits, and simply extending a hand to the student and saying, do you want to take my right hand or my left? Do you want to take my right hand or my left? That can be enough to penetrate that emotional brain and get us back into functioning with the logic brain. Provide choice. There are more direct and indirect strategies for discouraging inappropriate behavior in the attachment on Blackboard, and I highly recommend that you take a look there. If you'll get one of these, choose one of these strategies you think you'd like to implement in your future classroom, and then elaborate on it as an entry in your teaching strategies repertoire assignment. Now, just to preview a little bit what you'll be doing with your teams later today, in the professional team exercise, you will be working with other students who have a similar teaching aim as you. You're going to be creating a behavior matrix for your teaching setting. You're going to elaborate one routine that you will use in your teaching setting. And you can all work together to elaborate the same one routine, okay? And then you're going together to craft 4 positive feedback comments to make when students exhibit the desired behaviors. This is the start of your repertoire. Remember, we need to have 4 to 1 positive to negative comments, and you've got 180 teaching days. So if you can emerge from this one assignment with 4 scripted positive feedback comments, that's enough for one student for one period of the day. And you've got how many students across 180 days? Okay, but at least it's a start. So I want you to craft 4 positive behavior comments to make when students do exhibit our desired behaviors. That will help you draw a circle around the material about positive behavior supports that we've looked at today. And you will have many more opportunities to receive a fuller training in this classroom management system as you participate in new faculty orientation, new staff orientation, and other professional development days in your school districts. Thanks for joining me.